So, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Bernice Ojurumbe, and I'm the Programs Coordinator at SDSN Canada. And it's a national network hosted at the University of Waterloo to engage Canada's colleges and universities on the Sustainable Development Goals. Today's conversation is part of the Together Ensemble, Canada's All of Societies Conference on the SDGs, and it's an opportunity to rally the all society approach to addressing Canada's toughest sustainable development challenges, bringing together private sector, academia, government, and civil society. As I welcome you to today's session, I would like to acknowledge the history of the land on which I'm speaking on today, and I invite everyone on the call as well to kind of reflect on the land on which you're calling us from today. SDSN Canada is situated at the University of Waterloo, which is on traditional territory of the Atawandaran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated at the Honeyman Tract, the land granted to 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. The university's active work towards reconciliation takes place across all of its campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Office of the Indigenous Relations. Acknowledging the land like this helps remind us that Canada's achievements are directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous peoples, and that we must all push for transformative act over the coming decades toward reconciliation and justice. So a quick run through of our agenda today and a few housekeeping rules as well. We'll be having our conversation with our panelists for 25 minutes, and thereafter we'll open up the floor to everyone to ask their questions. As the conversation is going, we encourage everyone to please keep your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat, because it can get lost as people put their comments in the chat box. And so now I'm so excited about today's conversation, and I would like to turn it over to our moderator for the session today, Julie Wright, who is the director at Partners for Action, a research initiative based at the University of Waterloo that empowers Canadians to be flood risk resilient. Julie, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Mariniki. It's delightful to be here with everyone this morning to have this conversation about education. As Mariniki mentioned, I'm the Director of Partners for Action at the University of Waterloo, but I also sit on the advisory committee for SDSN Canada, and I'm on the board of directors at Education Canada. I also wear a completely other hat where I'm a city councillor in the city of Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. So just turning to today's session, our key objective is to explore the role of the SDGs in teaching and learning while showcasing some strategies to accelerate progress on SDG 4. So we've had a couple of our panelists drop off this morning due to illness and flight delays. As you know, there's a lot going on in Canada at the moment, and travel has been impacted by the forest fires. So we're going to sort of change up our structure a little bit, probably focus more on the Canada to global connections. And we won't dive in quite so in fine detail into what's happening in the classroom in Canada. So we're going to start off with a discussion about where we're at, maybe kind of in the course of the lead into the pandemic, and then where we're at now. And then we're going to talk about what we need to do in order to meet SDG 4, both in Canada and globally. And so we're going to get into a few specifics about teaching and learning, but probably not quite as much as we might have with Max Cook and Isabelle Leverchier-Song. So whenever we're addressing Canada and the SDGs, I like to frame the conversation in terms of what actions can we take that are catalytic, what might open up the possibilities within the SDG framework, what can we do that centers the people left behind by systemic racism, oppression, and colonial legacies, what are Canada's obligations to the rest of the world, and what do we need to do to steward at home for the benefit of others around the world. So as I mentioned, joining me is Sujani Kandasamy, who's the co-director and founder of the Starfish Canada. She's also a postdoctoral researcher at Brock University, working at the intersection of public health and environmental issues. The Starfish Canada works with young environmentalists, providing them with a community and platform to create impact. And we're also joined by Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger, who's a professor, expert jurist and leader, pioneer, and co-founder of the field of sustainable development law and governance. She's a visiting chair in sustainable law and policy at Cambridge, the Senior Director of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law at McGill University and a Fellow at the Balsley School of International Affairs in Waterloo. Her work supports multilateral treaty negotiations and compliance with the UN, international organizations, countries, also local and Indigenous communities. So I'm just going to jump right in here and kick off the conversation with Sujani. And so I just want to talk, let's back up to 2019 and talk a little bit about just the zeitgeist that we were experiencing at that point with Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future and this very, very big climate action that was happening globally. And then I'm hoping if you can just sort of thread the needle for us through the pandemic to where we are right now.
Sounds great. Thank you, Julie, for that question. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here and to speak on these important topics this morning, / evening, / whatever time it is from where you're joining us. So certainly, yes, Julie, I think before the pandemic, there was lots of movement, lots of in-person collective organizing and advocacy that was happening in various youth groups across Canada, across the globe. And that was certainly generating a lot of interest, a lot of potential solution generation as well. And it was interesting to see kind of the youth involvement and really kind of amplifying the youth voice a little bit more purposely in this space. And I think in the past, previous to that, perhaps youth have been, not always included as equal partners in conversations around the environment and stewardship and advocacy. So it was certainly moving towards that direction, I think. And with the pandemic, obviously putting a stop to in-person activities and slowing down on some of those initiatives, I think youth had to be a little bit more creative and think of other ways to amplify their voice and organize and kind of come together for solutions. And that's really kind of the focus of the work that we do at the Starfish Canada is really around solutions-based dialogue and involving young people, emergent learners in those conversations and really centering those voices and amplifying those voices. We've got a few different ways that we've done that have kind of spanned the test of the pandemic in a way, because we're a pan-Canada organization. We've always had to be somewhat virtual and somewhat have those virtual check-in and connection points with young people across country was just a natural part of the way that we functioned. And also having a motivation to really involve young people from rural communities and places that were really far from kind of the core of where a lot of the Starfish community members were living. We sort of developed this scaffold over the last 10 years to really be able to kind of capitalize on voices from different places in Canada. And I think that came to an advantage for us, when we were going through the pandemic, because we had to kind of switch to virtual options and we had to rely on other ways of communication that to strengthen the voices and not let that kind of fall behind just because we weren't able to connect in the same way that we were able to do so before. So I think one, like having that sort of layer of, I want to call it a scaffolding or a foundation for young people to connect and be part of those conversations despite being far apart from each other or not being able to connect in person, I think has been an advantage for us. And one example of this is we have a flagship program through the organization that we do annually. It's called Top 25 Under 25, and it's a it's an initiative to celebrate and bring a platform to young people that are doing really great work across the country. And so it's kind of like an amplification of the amazing work they're doing, and a mentorship opportunity to be able to connect them to other leaders in the space that they're kind of committed to, speaking opportunities. We've got a speakers bureau that they can participate in, education facilitator opportunities where they can, bring in some of the work that they've done in terms of like how they've addressed a challenge, an environmental challenge in their community, and how like the steps that they've taken to really address those at whether it's at a local level or a broader scale, and to be able to share those with other learners across the country. So it's really a way to bring those people together, and to form those natural, but also maybe more strategic connections amongst the groups so that they can advance their work and, really kind of grow the seed that they've planted within their communities. And that's something that we've been able to continue kind of across the scope of the pandemic, just because of the nature, as I described, of how we sort of functioned originally. But I recognize the challenges that, come outside of, having those scaffolding set up, and the changes that kind of have come with this, because it's certainly been an emotional change as well, in addition to like physical changes in how young people are able to participate in these conversations, and the motivation to be able to do so, I think, has also been impacted by the pandemic, certainly. And we've seen that in the classroom, like just, because we weren't able to go in person for a lot of our programming as well. Like we've had to be really creative in how we're going to continue to engage, not only from an accessibility standpoint, but an engagement perspective. Like, how do you reinvigorate that? And that is also a tough space. And it's just the nature of a lot of things kind of intersecting all at once and within the backdrop of the pandemic that I think has contributed to that. But yeah, maybe we'll get into some of those solutions.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up question here. I mean, you talked about some of these intersections, and so I'm, out of the pandemic, we definitely heard so much about mental health and well-being, and then also the social movements around equity and inclusion. So what are you seeing, just, briefly before we move into this global landscape, and we'll touch base with Marie-Claire, but what are you seeing in terms of all of these threads coming together? And then how does the SDGs, help or hinder that?
Yeah, great question. And I think we've seen it like through, the pandemic has certainly, I think, amplified a lot of inequities that were already present in our society, right? And I think it just really gave a light to some of those, and like more clarity to people perhaps on what was actually going on in some underrepresented communities, and such. Now, I think for us, like what's really been helpful is to focus on kind of the global competencies and the like looking at kind of critical thinking, problem solving, learning to learn. And I think those approaches have been like really useful in like the way that we've continued to design our programming. It's been really around like inquiry based, working in small groups to kind of pave your own path for how you're going to design solutions. And I think that really is a powerful thing for young people, because then you're able to kind of bring in these intersects that exist, and you're able to address them in a way that, is like empathy driven, and like, you're thinking kind of on a broader scale. And if I could just back up a tiny bit in terms of like the way that that's sort of set up in the context that we work in, we, like through our programming, we really try to focus on the solutions. So there's a little piece of our programming, like when we're in the classroom or in the community, that contextualizes a challenge, a real environmental challenge that is either local to Canada, or broad. Some of them are kind of on a more global scale, but generally in a Canadian context, we select real case studies that real communities are facing currently. And we produce like a really short, it's like a challenge case study. It's usually in a digital format, and it briefly summarizes kind of the key challenge and like the potential intersects, like socially, culturally, economics, politics wise, that are going to influence this challenge. The students watch that, and then we guide them through a facilitated process for learning to learn, and kind of like deciding like how they're going to prioritize the aspects of this challenge, and come up with whether it's at an individual level, at a community level, at a school level, or broader, a potential action for this issue that might not, seemingly affect them directly. But there's something that they can, contribute to address that, a part of that challenge or a threat of that challenge, and then communicate that, which I think is like a really big part of some of that competency piece as well. Like, what is the solution, and how are you going to, bring other people on board to be able to activate around this issue? And I think that really evolves like critical thinking and problem solving and innovation, and potentially like social entrepreneurship and other opportunities that could come out of that they could actually lead in their communities. And that kind of connects to that Top 25 program as well. And, introducing young people to that opportunity for mentorship and future guidance.
That's awesome. We're going to come back to this opportunity space in a few minutes, but I just want to switch to Marie-Claire at this point. And, you've made this great link, Sujani, between the Canadian context and the passion and motivations that young people have, but the need to be situated in the global context. So I just want to go to Marie-Claire for just a moment, and let's talk about, this Canada to global context and where we are in terms of Canada's obligations supporting education outcomes.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, and thanks also, Sujani, for those really inspiring ideas and projects that you're working on. I think it's just past 6 a.m. It's now coming around to 7 here in Vancouver Island, in Canada's west coast, and so I'm very, very glad to meet all of you. I was actually up at 5 in order to join a group from all over the world who are learning about law and policy for the SDGs. And it's really nice to see everybody here from across Canada and globally. I recognize some of the names on the PowerPoint. It's great to see you. I think I should start just by acknowledging and expressing respect for the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day, because I'm here in Victoria. I would also, however, because of my association with Cambridge, want to recognize my ancestors, the Iceni peoples, on whose ancient territories the University of Cambridge is found today. And so I think what I wanted to just add in terms of the questions that you're asking, Julie, is that what we have seen with the pandemic, and it's a strength and a weakness, it's a double-edged sword, is that young people, not just the rest of the world, have learned to collaborate more closely with each other online. And that is something that we're only just starting to take advantage of for the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's deeply critical. We are seeing that those personal connections between youth in the global north, youth in the global south, youth from all different areas of the world, add a special kind of education. It's much harder to demonize an entire country or an entire region in an immigration debate when you've just come off an eco seminar with a conversation with your colleague and friend from Kenya, who's explaining about how under SDG 2, zero hunger, she's worried about the men who are lining up in the market below her window in order to get food for their families, and how sometimes people can get angry when they can't get the food that they have queued for hours to get in Nairobi. And children can understand these realities that each other face and start to understand each other in a way that is essential in a world where we use each other's resources, where we use each other's economic potential. And yet we often forget that we need to also then collaborate on the economy and collaborate on the environment and collaborate on our societies and our quality of life for everyone. And so I think this is something that the Sustainable Development Goals really bring us. They bring us those priorities that every country, developed or developing, every community, at whatever level of access to resources and access to engagement they have something to contribute. So maybe I think what I would like to highlight now, because I think you're right, Sujani, to just focus on a couple of concrete examples of interesting ways that we can support education outcomes and also make an impact on stewarding progress on the SDGs, and especially, of course, SDG for education. I've seen a really inspiring program that I've had the privilege of being deeply involved in. Here in Cambridge and worldwide during the climate strikes, a lot of the different youth groups and schools created eco-societies or climate change clubs, and they organized in their cities the climate strikes. I mean, here in Cambridge, for example, we had 31 schools in the Eco Council, and they were all working together to organize the climate strikes. And actually, we had a climate strike on the Friday planned when the news of the pandemic shut down the schools on the Thursday. And the kids, without batting an eye, moved the whole thing online in less than 24 hours. It was an incredible cooperation because we would have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 kids coming out for our strikes, and the Cambridge colleges would all ring their bells in alarm like they used to on the Fens thousands of years ago when a flood was coming, in order to be in solidarity with the children. It was an incredible movement with kids as young as 5 marching at the front, and everybody else being careful not to push because otherwise you might trample the youngest ones holding the banners. And what we saw with the climate strikes in particular, because it engaged so many kids from so many schools, once they went online, the young people kept sharing what they were experiencing during the pandemic. And of course, almost right away, they realized that some schools were able to get things together and do Zoom education, and others, their friends had been handed a textbook and told, read a chapter a week, hopefully we'll see it in September. And this was and these kids had, life-defining exams here in the UK, GCSEs, coming up that they were not going to be prepared for. And that impact would be felt throughout their whole rest of their life. And so what we saw with the youth who were involved in the climate strikes was that they switched their gears and they started organizing pandemic tutorials. They contacted all of us, all the different professors in different universities who were known to care about the SDGs. They said, we want to do them on science, law, and sustainability. And we want to talk to any professors who are willing for 1 hour online, 3 times a week. And we would like you to give us some websites that we can use to be able to access more resources afterwards. So we're not just falling on pseudoscience because we don't know what to look for. And it was mainly an initiative of the kids who were getting some Zoom education for all the kids who weren't. But by the end, we had over 800 students from 94 countries participating in these seminars or these tutorial sessions with professors, and they build themselves, the youth who are stranded by the pandemic, and they were able to mobilize. And that kind of informal education engagement that can go on alongside the formal education isn't ending when the pandemic ends. And so what we're seeing even now is the youth organizing themselves. They've got an online journal they've put together called Harmony. They've got a global youth council that they've put together based on that cooperation. And they're starting to intervene together with the other youth networks in the different Sustainable Development Goal related treaty negotiations. And so we're seeing them appear and turn up and ask for assistance to participate in the decision-making that concerns them. And I think there's maybe just 2 other points I would make. The first is that we talk about Sustainable Development Goal for, and we talk about our binding treaty obligations in this area and what Canada can do and what all countries can do. And one of the most important treaties in this area is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And what the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees is that children will have a voice in decision-making that concerns them. The Sustainable Development Goals, these youth have told us many times, definitely concern them. I mean, it's existential, actually. And so we're seeing in the Paris Agreement, we're seeing in the Global Biodiversity Framework, we're seeing in the negotiations that are going on around the world, these young people mobilizing and being part of that decision-making with a very, very powerful voice. And they come from all over. Some of them have even formed a Young Negotiators Academy, which has been incredible to see. They have something called YUNGOs, the youth NGOs, that are in all of the negotiating sessions. And they're bringing forward the solutions that they're developing in their own countries and communities and sharing them. And they're not just doing it for the youth and the older young people who can participate at that level globally. There's also an initiative, and I wanted to end with this because I find it highly inspiring. I'll put the link in the chat, called Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiative. And it's about implementing the Convention on the Rights of the Child at the level of sort of 6, 7, 8, up to 12-year-olds. And the young people, they write stories, and they have a network of volunteer illustrators and a network of judges in each region of the world. And they assess the kids' stories, and then they help them publish them with the illustrators from Masters of Children's Book Illustration helping them. And the lawyers from my center actually do a lot of the pro bono translation into the 6 UN languages. And these are stories about the Sustainable Development Goals by children for children, and how empowering themselves and empowering the child characters in their books can actually also wake up local solutions and wake up even global voices. And what we've seen, of course, with those books is that they've gone viral. They're part of the world's largest lesson, where it has materials for all 17 SDGs. And they've been distributed around the world in schools as an alternative to the type of materialist, consumerist, often very, very northern centered. If you don't have 6 televisions and 12 cars, you're just not making it. Where's your private jet? Sort of television and popular media, including the celebrity-driven media, which is educating the kids, whether we admit it or not. So what I saw from that children's initiative, and what I think was the fundamental insight, is actually what one of the children told us during one of the eco seminars they organized after the pandemic. Now that they're all comfortable with this format, they're still using it, even though they can also meet in person sometimes. And most of them refuse to travel by plane because of the carbon emissions. And what the young people said was, look, younger children listen to older children, and they listen to them more than they'll listen to politicians or teachers or their parents or even celebrities. And it was in that order. And so if older children are willing to work with younger children and offer them a vision of the SDGs, offer them a vision of a different kind of world, and do it in a way that is global, that isn't locking the borders, that isn't building walls. We'll let your resources in, but we won't let you in. We won't let you work with us. We won't cooperate with you. We won't help make the whole world a better place. Then that zeitgeist, that new awareness and ability to interact internationally, I think can enrich everyone. And I think that it's a really important point to remember. You know, I don't know how many people here had a pen pal program when you were in school.
I did.
Right? I did too. And I was exchanging
Nigeria, Papua New Guinea.
Oh, you're
I'm
lucky.
still in touch.
That's awesome.
I'm still in touch with my Norwegian pen pal.
No, my pen pal was Colonivière, and it was right during the debate about Quebec separating from Canada. And my pen pal actually came out and visited us in Victoria. And then her family changed their mind, decided they were willing to stay in Canada. Now think about that globally, right? I mean, we do want people to stay on our planet, and we want them caring about it and committed to actually stopping some of these global crises that people often in their countries, particularly the 120 countries that have been most active in these online networks, you know, there's nothing, their emissions are so negligible. They aren't the ones who did this. And yet they're going to be the ones who are turned into climate refugees and don't even have a country to call their own. And so I think there's a lot to be said here for the cooperation that is possible when it starts young, and using the opportunity of the pandemic and the comfort that so many kids have now with using Zoom, with using, whatever their system is, to build those networks and those collaborations now.
Mhm.
And the SDGs is the framework to do it. It really
Yeah,
has
that common language. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Threading all these different issues through one framework. So I just want to go back to a few of the particulars here. So, we've talked about the importance of technology to enable young people to be able to, and get onto a platform together and to collaborate, and the stickiness of that, a set of habits that were reinforced during the pandemic. We've talked about the kinds of resources that are available to global communities of kids. We've talked about the need for collective experiences, like as we had with Fridays for the Future, and that kind of zeitgeist of getting involved in something with your peers. We've also talked about youth leading other youth, and so let's go back to some of the tactical things. How do we make sure that we're continuing to support and empower young people in this next leg of the SDGs? Like, if you can think of particular legacies that you would want the kids to have from this point forward, what would they be? I'm going to open the floor to both of you on this, and we'll start with Sujani and then go back to Marie-Claire.
Wow, tough question, Julie. I think there's a lot to be said here, and I guess one thing that I kind of wanted to pick up on in general around this is the power of sharing stories, the power of storytelling as a tool to share information and to connect people on like an empathy-driven ground, in a way that a lot of other tools are not able to do. So I wanted to draw on that as kind of like the stem of perhaps like what could be like a toolkit of opportunities to be able to continue to build on this momentum and to keep moving forward. And I know it's been powerful to see that, like even from our small lens as an organization, when young people use stories or like personal narratives that have impacted them to share what like the gravity of situations are like in different places and spaces. And I think that's a critical piece of the ways that we can kind of connect like the global citizenship to the critical thinking, to the innovation, and sprouting kind of solutions that come from those stories. And the other thing I'll say is also around, I guess, like as we move more towards I guess digital tools, digital literacy, and really building in the capacities for that. I think part of it is like the accessibility piece of all of that. The other part is also the engagement of all of that. Like there's also a lot of like screen fatigue, and like we're always telling young people to get off the screens, and then now we're sort of navigating that as an opportunity for connection. So it's all a little bit of a mismatched kind of situation in terms of like what we're encouraging young people to participate in, or what they might be interested in as avenues for collaboration. And so I think that's kind of a tough spot, like when we're sort of doing like the conversation or the dialogue is kind of moving in that direction. But I think in general, like with the engagement piece, I think there's a lot of opportunities there for a lot of student-led opportunities. And so like one thing that we've got at the Starfish Canada is it's a Youth Advisory Action Council. And so this is a group of currently 10 members across Canada, from the Yukon to the East Coast. We've got members in the West Coast. We've got centrally as well, that are in high school that help sort of facilitate or liaise between what's going on in their communities and what would be useful as like engagement opportunities as we move kind of more towards like digital tools and digital ways of connecting. So it's really like a student-led kind of initiative. And I think that's really, really important because it's been a while since I've been a youth. I mean, when we started the Starfish Canada, I certainly was, but it's been 10 years and I'm moving further and further away from being one. So I think really centering young people's voices and what that looks like is a key part of that, rather than kind of like, this is what we should do, or this is perhaps what's worked in the past, because the past is also so very different from what we're facing now and the challenges that we are kind of up against. So that's been hugely beneficial for our small group, is to have that council and engage that council. But then it's kind of like a catch-22, because then we're also engaging them online, and that can be tricky as well. So it's like these little loops of like, how do you do engagement well in this space? And but I certainly think that that's been a key part of that. And one of the interests that has sprouted from that, I guess another stem off of that larger stem, is a more two-eyed seeing programs, more curriculum that interweave different ways of knowing into the programs that we do. So for example, we've recently developed it's a climate science workshop series that is a two-eyed seeing framework, and includes Indigenous ways of knowing with kind of Western approaches to understanding this material woven together. And I think there's a lot of interest from young people for that material, as well as other ways of knowing as well, interwoven with kind of Western approaches for investigating and kind of looking at these challenges and the magnifying glass that we use, and kind of bringing those together in different ways. So I'm gonna give Marie-Claire the last word on this before we switch to a question or two. Where should we be going?
Oh, well, that's simple.
Yeah, I know. It's a big question, right?
Yeah, but I think actually it's there are the beginnings of some answers, and I actually normally try to look on it at the global, the national, and the local level. I think Sujana has given a really, really clear vision for what can and should be able to happen at the local level, and also linking together and informing national policy, I think, is still crucial. In some of the youth and children's realities that are collaborating with us, it's just a question of, walking down the street because you're on a small island, and the decision making is being done just down the street. In other countries like Canada, you need to look for creative ways. I heard from our Minister of Trade that during the pandemic, every hour, like for 1 hour every night, she just went online and took calls from small business owners across Canada that hour as an accountability mechanism. And I would love to see that kind of thing continuing for a whole society in different countries of the world, where that direct accountability is possible. And it's not as hard to organize as you think. And cybersecurity can be put in place so that the conversations are respectful. But at the global level, I think one of the first places we can start is around the international commitments we've made, not just the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the global treaties that have been taking on binding obligations in these areas that so many countries are struggling to deliver on. And we are going backward, it's no question. We were starting to go forward on some of the SDGs and to meet some of our treaty obligations, including in the Paris Agreement, and we're going backward now. But it's a really, really tough situation. You saw what was necessary in terms of crashing the global economy that reduced some carbon emissions, sort of. And you think about whether we would be able to mobilize that again. I think without another pandemic, it would be very difficult. And that's from somebody who's just finished reading Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson.
Oh, I know. That's going to be one of the most depressing and small hope.
Well, one thing that I will say is that there's a lifelong learning aspect to SDG4. And
Absolutely.
what we can do and what we have to do is engage all of the professions, not just the legal profession that I'm so deeply involved in, but the engineers, the medics, everybody who has any kind of professional union or association in helping to turn their own profession towards something that is not just net zero or carbon negative, but is actually fostering rather than frustrating sustainable development goals. And I do think that there are ways to do that. In our work right now with my new chair in Cambridge and the professorship in Canada, together with the CISDL, what we have been doing is offering free online courses to help people to understand ways to change the law and to engage their local bar associations and others across their society in delivering the sustainable development goals and the related binding treaty obligations. And I do think that that kind of work, offering free online courses to each other, forming communities of practice, working locally, and then reporting globally and sharing ideas and cooperating globally, and then again, making further changes locally. It's the only way we can make this work. I know it seems as though it's a big world and we have to divide it up with lots of borders, but actually that image of the Earth from space, we're pretty tiny in the universal context. And
incredibly connected, right?
We have to be. We have to learn to be. So it's a global inclusion as well as a national or local inclusion question. And unless we want to stop using all of the different, lifestyle benefits that we have been taking from the global economy, we have to be able to include the people whose countries we're taking those from. And that isn't something that I can see happening quite yet. But it's something that for the SDGs to be realized, we are going to need to do.
Okay, so we're going to turn to a couple questions from our audience here. So just number one from Joanna, considering the apparent lack of emphasis on academic institutions in the latest federal budget, how can we proactively tackle these challenges, foster an environment conducive to teaching, learning, and research pertaining to climate-related matters? With the second part of that question being, how can we effectively engage the government to promote increased investment in climate for academic institutions, facilitating advancements in research and educational initiatives? So it's really about funding to empower those academic institutions to teach and to create these learning opportunities, which I think you were partly commenting on there, Marie-Claire. Like where do those educational opportunities come from?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it is starting by working within our universities and within the other education institutes and also the bodies that decide how curriculum is prioritized and reprioritized. A lot of the challenges we saw in the UK from Brexit, I think also came because the promises that have been made about engagement with the European Union weren't materializing for a large majority of people. And it was starting at the education level. And so people were feeling excluded, they were feeling frustrated, and they'll vote against the possibilities of global collaboration or even just regional collaboration if they feel that it's just some kind of cosmo elite that wants to fly around and go to festivals and buy a sandwich in Paris for lunch and then come back to New York. And that kind of that set of values that runs against what the Sustainable Development Goals stand for, it needs to be challenged in our universities and in our schools. And I don't think it's just about funding. I think funding would go a long way to helping make things different. But I think it's also about what we invest in our education structures and how much we engage those young people. Possibly one of the most inspiring things I did see, and I'll close with this, was one of the climate strikes that was organized right after the pandemic. Now, I don't know how much you know about the University of Cambridge, but we're over 30 colleges, and each college does its own admissions process. And so, they're making those decisions independently, right? And there's about, probably 2,000 applications for every 4 places we can give. It's terrible. It's really, really hard choices that are being made. And, the young people, the children, the 12-year-olds who were going down to their little climate strike and holding a candle and planning to just be there for an hour, even though they hadn't organized anything, sent out a message to the university saying, if any of the university students would like to come, please do, because we're a really small group now. They can make it in person this Friday. We were absolutely shocked when over 700 young people turned up, and they were from those colleges, and they were first-year students who had been selected during the pandemic, and they were climate strikers. So we've got to break that myth that if you get involved, you get active, you become a leader on sustainability issues, you're somehow not academically able to move forward, because it's clearly not true.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to change our education system so that we're encouraging and supporting the young people demanding the kinds of things they need for their future and starting to make them actually happen. So I do think
we're at time now, so we got to wrap this up, unfortunately, Mary Claire. And I really appreciate so much everybody's passion for this conversation. I feel like we could have taken it for another hour at least. So I just want to wrap this all by just saying, you know, it's very clear that we have a lot of bridges to build, and hooray for SDG 17 and Partnership for the Goals, because that's, I think, where we get to that action. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all of your experiences and your expertise. And thank you also for Mariniki for being our SDSN host today. Really appreciate that. Together Ensemble is a huge undertaking. So thank you so much to the whole team for your support. So as we wrap this session, I'm just going to encourage you all to go forth and do great things. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to all the panelists. As a follow-up, we'll be forwarding the recording for today's session in an email after this session. And also the other side events happening for the Together Ensemble. We encourage everyone to look up the website and see what conversation you would like to join. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you.